video lecture on referential integrity. We've seen referential integrity, and we've set up referential integrity in the ERDs, right? In the ERDs, we've set up, the one-to-many relationships. In our create table statements, we've seen that we can set up primary key constraints and foreign key constraints between tables that have a one-to-many relationship. And what do we want to do with referential integrity, or what does referential integrity allow us to do? The restrictions are, or what we're trying to control, is the deletion of primary key records, right? Updating primary key records, and the insertion of dependent records in the child tables. So again, the idea of this is that we do not want to orphan records. So if I have a student, I have a student record, that student has enrolled in courses, we want to prevent users from damaging the data in such a way as to go into that student record and either change the primary key value, which would orphan enrollment records in the enrollment table, and we don't want, we want to restrict users from deleting student records to create orphaned records. Or we want to allow things like that. I mean, in the student enrollment scenario, you certainly don't want that to happen. But in other scenarios, you may. So let's just take a look at what the commands look like. So this is just an extension of the create table statement. So here we see the create table statement for customer T. And it's, creating its fields, not null, customer ID, integer, blah, blah, blah. And it's working its way through, and then we get down to the constraint section. When we get down to the constraint section, we're setting up the primary key, and then we're adding the referential integrity to say on update restrict. That's the default. You don't have to type that in. If you simply say, if you simply make it the primary key, it will on update restrict in most database management systems. But you can certainly put that in there to make sure that that actually happens. That happens after a comma, right? So we have our constraint, the constraint is created, we have a comma, and then after that we say upon update restrict, and that is going to affect the primary key. We have different options for this. The other options are not often used for various reasons, but I just want to make you aware of them. So we can cascade the update. So if we decide to change the primary key, so we want to go into the customer ID and we want to change it, and when we change it, we want it to cascade to its child tables, the command instead of on update restrict would be on update cascade. The same with set null. So if I go into the customer table and I go to a particular customer and I change their customer ID to null, or just change it in any way, then what is going to happen is it's going to go into the child table that is that references that value and set all those values to null. Right? So if I have customer ID, 110, it's going to go to any table that references the customer table, and it's going to change all the customer IDs that were 110 to null. Okay? And we also have on update set default. So if you look at the create table statement, customer ID is an integer, the default is 999. That's one way of ensuring data integrity, that we always have a value put into the customer ID. But what's going to happen is when a customer ID is changed, any customer ID in the order table that matches the old customer ID is set to a predefined default value. So if I change customer ID 110 to 555, any table that references it, in this case the order table, would go through and find all of the 110s and change them to a default value of 999. And again, in our scenarios, in the databases that we're creating, none of these other scenarios would fit, but certainly they've been designed because there are situations where you do want to use these options. And that is the end of referential integrity with create table statements.